And so thank you all for coming today. We're really excited to have Professor Casey Johnson. This is really the start of Uncomfortable Learning at Williams, where we're looking forward to having guest speakers to challenge the Williams orthodoxy, really promote intellectual diversity on campus for the next year and a half. And we're really happy to have Professor Johnson here.
Yeah, no, like Ben said, Professor Casey Johnson here is a professor of history at Brooklyn College right now, and he's taught here also for several years, and he gives a very interesting perspective on this, and we're very excited to hear him. So, thank you, Professor.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you all very much for coming out. I do admit when I got the invitation, I wasn't sure exactly how many people would be here. During my time at Williams, I was not a big January term person, and I was always able to trade off with someone who did want to teach January term, so I never actually was here during this semester. I am from Maine, and I wanted to start off with a little vignette that will lead into some of the themes that I'm talking about here. Maine, for most of the 20th century, was really a quite insular state. People left, but they didn't tend to move in. The state dropped from 4 to 3 to 2 members of Congress as people sort of fled out. And like a lot of states in World War II, post-Cold War, early post-Cold War period, it was a state where the political, the economic, the intellectual elite really consisted of people who were educated by institutions in Maine. And for a variety of reasons, the state university, which is in a remote town called Orono, which is around 2.5 hours north of Portland, never really was the intellectual center of the state. It was not well funded, and no one really wanted to go to Orono anyway. And as a result, it was Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby, and especially Bowdoin, that became the center of the state. And the college really took on it as a mission of training citizens, the new political leaders of the state. And this era reached its high point in the 1970s when these 3 men were the dominant political figures in the state. To the left is George Mitchell, who was a Democratic senator who was later on a majority leader of the Senate. Those of you who are baseball fans know him as the author of the steroid investigation report in Major League Baseball a few years ago. On the top right was William Cohen, who was a Republican senator from Maine. Was later Bill Clinton's defense secretary. And at the bottom was Jim Longley, who was the first independent governor elected in Maine in the 1970s. And all 3 of them had been educated by Bowdoin, as had been around half of the Maine state legislature in the 1970s. There was this real connection between the college and the state. That connection is no longer particularly present. The current governor of Maine, those of you who follow politics know him, is Paul LePage, who was elected in 2010 on running this explicitly anti-intellectual platform. LePage is often in the news with these kind of off-the-wall statements. My favorite one was the third one. He suggested that all Maine high school graduates who entered William and Mary, and why he chose William and Mary, no one knew, had to take remedial exams because William and Mary knew that Maine high schools were terrible for education. They interviewed the people at William and Mary. They had no idea what he was talking about. But there's no pretense on LePage's part, and really on the part of much of the Maine state legislature, that there's any kind of intellectual connection to the colleges in the state. But there's no pretense from the other side as well. Beginning in the 1980s, Bowdoin started to redefine itself and dropped this, what I think was really a quite commendable mission of training the next generation of Maine citizens, Maine voters, and Maine political leaders. And as part of that mission, in Bowdoin, the Department of History had this very aggressive approach of citizenship training. Now, these are the specialties of the current Department of History at Bowdoin. And what you see is a fairly typical array in American history departments around the country, with one exception. Most departments don't have 2 environmental historians of the American West, especially if they're in Brunswick, Maine. But other than that, there was a real move away from what's deemed traditional history, a study of dead white men, a study of public policy, a study of the United States and the world, a very heavy emphasis on race and on gender. And that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight, how the study of US history has transformed in the academy and what this means about, what this says about intellectual diversity and broadness of thought on campus. A few caveats in terms of why I've taken this, this approach in terms of US. Three things. First, as some of you know, if any of you have been involved in academic searches and welcoming potential candidates to campus, when departments hire in history, except for very, very large departments, the only positions where they really distinguish tend to be in the United States. They'll hire in US foreign policy, they'll hire in race, they'll hire in gender, they'll hire in sexuality. In Europe, that tends not to be the case. In Africa, Latin America, it's almost never the case. So you can get a sense of how the profession is changing by looking at the US in a way that you can't elsewhere. Secondly, there are a lot of connections, both legal, moral, and to some extent in terms of alumni, dealing with how US history is taught that's different from other areas. And third, there have been a lot of interesting controversies over the last decade with regard to US history that speak to broader themes on campus. Okay, so a quickie summary. The instruction of US history, like the instruction of basically all elements of American higher education, dates from roughly the 1930s, although there are, of course, universities that are well before that. And for around 40 years, the study of US history in elite universities was essentially the study of dead white men. And these are some of the major books from the time. Broad coverage of politics, of foreign policy, of the law, of military history. Sometimes called in the 1950s and 1960s consensus history. There was this sense that it was the purpose of historians to prove that the United States was a wonderful nation that never did anything wrong in international affairs. One of the famous figures from this period was a Yale historian named Samuel Flagg Bemis, whose nickname was Samuel Fly the Flag Bemis because the United States never did wrong in his books. Now, this approach to history shifted in two phases. The first was in the 1960s and early 1970s, when social historians started criticizing the way history was taught. And they made the quite reasonable point of, in this era of civil rights, of women's rights, of the movement for Native American rights a little bit later in the 1970s, why are these topics not covered? And so history departments around, US history department contingents around the country started expanding. And so they would hire social historians, they would hire historians of race or of gender. But the default position always was that in history, as in most of the humanities and social sciences, knowledge expands. It does not contract, that we are adding new things to the discipline, but we are not taking things away. This is not the study of creationism in biology or anti-gay thought in psychology, where items had simply been proven wrong and are discredited. The idea was we will expand. In the 80s and especially in the 90s, this approach began to change, and there was a second shift. There was a much greater emphasis in terms of hiring on race, class, gender, and ethnicity in history. And a movement away from what was deemed as traditional kinds of history. And so by 2003, the sort of study of history around the country had changed quite dramatically. In 2003, I was asked for complicated reasons to testify before a Senate committee that was looking into intellectual diversity on college campuses. The chairman of the committee was a New Hampshire Republican senator named Judd Gregg, who was very interested in these sorts of approaches. And the ranking Republican on the committee was Lamar Alexander, who was the former Secretary of Education, who was also interested in these sorts of things. And they had me in to talk about how history was taught. And as part of that approach, I did a survey of the 30 largest public university history departments in the country. And I picked public history departments in part because of an assumption that these departments would be unusually sensitive to the need to have a broad instruction in history, because after all, to some extent, their budgets were paid for by state legislators who would have a self-interested rationale in ensuring breadth in instruction. And what I found is that there were 3 departments out of 30, these 3, Virginia, Ohio State, and Alabama, where half or more of the departments in their US history contingents focused on what were deemed traditional topics: military history, political history, constitutional history, diplomatic history, or business and economic history. Of the 30, 20 of the 30 had 25% or fewer of their faculty that were approaching these topics. And these numbers haven't shifted in the last decade, with one exception. Ohio State is no longer at 50%. They've dropped below. The patterns have more or less remained the same. So you get a transformation in fields. Transformation in fields occur all the time, but there are a few other things which are going on. The first is that, in contrast really to any period within the study of history until this time, there really has been a contraction. The first to go is US military history. This is one area where I think you can make a pretty compelling argument that political influence did shape personnel decisions. In the 1960s and 1970s, the height of Vietnam anti-war activism on a lot of college campuses, military historians were perceived, not entirely incorrectly, as excessively sympathetic to the generals that they studied. Their activities were frequently linked to campus ROTC efforts. Many colleges and universities expelled ROTC in the late 60s and 1970s. And departments more or less terminated these positions once the holders of them retired. Today, if you're looking for a good US military historian, you can go to one of the service academies. You can go to a public university in the South. Just about every public university in the South has a US military historian. Or you can study military history outside of the United States, where it remains studied to some extent. But if you're going to an Ivy League school, if you're going to an elite liberal arts college, if you're going to a top-rate non-Southern public university, your chances of studying with a US military historian are more or less zero. The other subfield to essentially vanish, and again, this is highly unusual, the idea of contracting knowledge, was constitutional history, which more or less shifted to law schools. So if you happen to go to a law school, you can study under a legal historian, you can take courses in legal history, but most people, for very good reasons, don't go to law school, and as a result, they never encounter it. So these 2 subsets of the American past more or less have been eliminated from curricula at most elite institutions around the country. Now, eliminating business history proved to be impossible, but business history has shifted a lot. One of the reasons is money. Colleges may sometimes be quite ideological in their decisions, but the one thing just about all colleges like more than ideology is money. And in the last 30 years, there's been a lot of money on Wall Street, and a lot of that money has flowed to colleges and universities around the country, especially to business schools and business programs for obvious and understandable reasons. And so business history has been funded generally outside, US business history, has been funded outside of history departments in these new, very wealthy business programs. But the big 2 in terms of US history, more, at least technically, remain, although they're diminished: US political history, US diplomatic history. But they've changed in ways that, again, fit with this theme of contracting knowledge to advance a kind of, to use Ben's phrase, an orthodoxy on campus. Political history is the most obvious. So this is an excerpt, a screenshot of a 1995 article by a historian named Mark Leff, who was a historian at the University of Illinois. The article is seen often as the summons to what is called a new political history. And the key sections in the article I've highlighted here in red. The left argument is that political historians, so political historians are people who study US government activities, US public policy. They frequently use government sources. In general, their subjects are dead white men, because for most of American history, public policy was made in this country by dead white men. The argument of new political historians is that political history should be history from below, that it should study activities of African Americans, of women, of Hispanics, who are attempting to change politics at the grassroots. A lot of the stuff that had been studied by social historians in the 1970s and 1980s. The key element, though, in the left was describing what the alternative to this new political history was. According to left, the alternative was not an intensive, rigorous study of government archives to try to determine what the US government did, why it did it, what mistakes, what we can learn from these mistakes. The alternative, according to left, was if you don't do it in this new political history way, you're only interested in a celebratory history that is something labeled traditional political history that's motivated by politically motivated attacks from outside the profession. The only thing that this column did not have was well-funded right-wing think tanks, which is the normal catchphrase for any of these lines of attack. This, of course, is absurd. There are lots of activities that can and were studied that were highly critical of US government activity. So again, this sort of approach. And I'll talk a little bit more about how this has funneled its way into personnel matters in a bit. The second shift has been in diplomatic history, which is what I was trained in, and slightly oversimplified. US diplomatic history traditionally has gone along two patterns. The first was a kind of international history, multi-archival, historians doing research in foreign archives, matching that up with the United States, trying to see how the US interacted with foreign nations. The second was looking, and those are the top two books by Kara Arya and Ernest May, who were my two advisors at graduate school. The second approach was to look at the interaction between US domestic forces in the making of US foreign policy, US government institutions, and how that shaped foreign policy. Two of the prominent books in that are this book by John Lewis Gaddis, classic in diplomatic history, and then this book by Tom Nock that looked at World War I. In the last 15 or 20 years, diplomatic history has shifted, in part because there's no way you can really reframe diplomatic history not to study the activities of government. So the shift has been to drop that second emphasis, the emphasis on government activities and domestic forces, and to redefine diplomatic history as international or even transnational history. For those of you who are interested in bureaucratic politics, one of the advantages of this approach is that it means oftentimes these hires can occur outside of an Americanist contingent in departments, which tend to be more open to these forces. There's been some great work done in this. One of the best is this fairly new book by Matt Conley, which looks at the transnational history of world population. There's studies of disease, these inherently transnational topics. But again, there's a limitation. If you define history, international history, as solely transnational topics, topics dealing with the intersection between domestic forces and the making of US foreign policy, and the US remains, like it or not, the strongest country in the world, more or less get excluded. All right, so how has this been seen in the profession? Last week was the annual meeting of the American Historical Association, which is the major conference of American historians. Every year they hold an academic conference. Up-and-coming academics present papers. More established academics present their research. This is a bar chart of topics at the conference. There were 69 panels at the conference that dealt with US history in one way or another. And as you can see, the emphasis was not on topics that would be deemed traditional history. Very few on military or legal, few more on political, but mostly US history now, as defined by the AHA, centers around race, culture, gender, sexuality, and ethnicity. 4 of these topics out of 69 were somewhat conventional topics, looking at Watergate, looking at the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, looking at post-war conservatism, and looking at the Health Care Act. But for the most part, even political or diplomatic history topics at the convention tended to be a little more towards this new political history approach. For instance, this top argument, it's kind of a military history topic. It's looking at the Civil War, but it's looking at through the prism of gender, not through the prism of military actions. The only constitutional history panel at this year's conference out of 69 was this top one that dealt with imprisonment in the United States through the prism of Foucault. Again, not perhaps in an appropriate lens, but as the sole topic out of 69, there seems to be something exclusionary there. And how does this how does this shape in terms of personnel? I took a look at, several years ago and returned to it for this talk, at the staffing at the University of Michigan. Michigan is a department that rates in the top 10 in US history. US News and World Report rates everything. Among the things that they rate are history departments, and they break it down in terms of region. They always rank in the top 10. They have a reputation within the discipline as being very prestigious, and for both political and diplomatic, they had sort of long histories of really top-flight people. And you more or less see a department that has chosen to dramatically emphasize race, gender, and sexuality. Hardly anyone doing political or diplomatic history, only one person doing the law. And again, very much this emphasis on new approaches. The two diplomatic historians at University of Michigan, one focuses on jazz diplomacy during the Cold War, looking at jazz musicians who traveled around the world. And the second is this new person who looks at global environmental history. These are both perfectly appropriate topics, but in a department that offers nothing else but this, there seems to be a whole lot that's left out. So how did we get to this point? Any of you who have ever welcomed a visiting job candidate on campus know that the hiring process in the academy is remarkably opaque. It is very difficult to determine why departments hire the kind of people that they do, in part because the only people who are in the room during the hire are members of the department who tend not to speak publicly about why they make their choice. But there was one interesting controversy a few years ago at the University of Iowa that gave some sense of the thinking behind these approaches. Iowa, not a top 10 department, but a quite good department that had a long-standing tradition of very high-quality political and diplomatic history. I've focused a couple of these books. Alice Hawley, who was the father of this theory called corporatism, this idea of emergence between business and politics, and Lawrence Gelfand, who was a longtime diplomatic historian. In 2007, a historian named Mark Moyar, who was the subject of my last visit here, Professor McAllister did a conference on one of his books, and who I knew a little. He was a student of mine when I was a TA in graduate school, applied for an open diplomatic history job at the University of Iowa. At the time that he applied, he had 2 books published, and these were the 2 books. They were extremely well-researched books, but they were books with a clear-cut point of view. The fact that former generals blurbed them and said what a wonderful historian Mark Moyar was gave a sense that this was not a critical attack on American military performance in Vietnam. There were lots of reasons why a history department would not have wanted to hire Mark Moyar. There were lots of historians who were critical of his work. I, in fact, in the presentation that I gave at this conference, criticized him for not paying enough attention to Congress. And when you do a job talk, go to campus, there are lots of things that you can do wrong. when I was on the job market many years ago, I applied for a job at North Carolina State, and I thought I did just a sensational interview, a really good job talk. I thought it was going great. And then I got asked a question. And when you go on a job talk, you're supposed to look at what everyone in the department has done, so you're familiar with what their scholarship is. And there was this one person, they were the only person in the department, whose scholarship was not listed on the department website. I looked at all of the publications. This person had no listed publications. It turns out that she hadn't published anything. She'd just done a dissertation. And she asked me this question. Her work was on Memphis. And it was just sort of an out-of-the-blue question. And the answer that I gave strongly implied that I found her approach to the topic wholly unsuitable, which is an answer that I never would have given if I had known what she was writing about. So there are lots of things that you can just do wrong on and of course I didn't get the job. There are lots of things that you can do wrong on a job talk that, it's very hard for an outsider to second guess why departments make the choices that they do. However, in this Iowa search, it wasn't that Moyar went to Iowa and didn't do well. It wasn't that at all. Iowa chose not to grant him a preliminary interview. Generally, departments interview 10 people at a preliminary stage. And that seemed very odd to quite a few people. The idea that you have 2 books published and you can't even be in the top 10 for a job that's in diplomatic history. And so Moyar complained. He concluded, probably correctly at this point, that he was unlikely to get a job. Moyar was if you did a 2-minute Google search, you could determine he was very, very conservative politically as well. So there was a combination of things. And he complained to the Human Resources Department at the University of Iowa. And he pointed to their website. And Iowa was and is one of the only schools in the country that actually has an intellectual diversity requirement. When you apply for a job at Iowa, if you represent a viewpoint that is not well represented on campus, which, as it turns out at Iowa, was, if you're a conservative Republican, you're supposed to get a bonus. And so Moyar complained. He said, look, why didn't I get this bonus? And he was told, well, you would have gotten a bonus if you had been one of the 10 preliminary interviews, but since you weren't, we don't apply this standard to anyone who's not a finalist. So he then complained publicly, and he claimed that he was attacked for political reasons. It's very hard to prove that you're attacked for political reasons, and it's my experience there are very, very few historians who are attacked for political reasons. And the response of any academic department that may have done something wrong when they're publicly criticized should be to shut up. But that's not what the University of Iowa department did. Instead, they tried to publicly defend the decision, again, not to give a preliminary interview to this obviously qualified candidate. The chair of the department, Moyar, pointed out that the department, the partisan breakdown in the department was 22 registered Democrats and 0 registered Republicans. Partisan breakdowns in departments can be really a crude measurement, and I speak from experience here. I'm a registered Democrat. I was an Obama donor in 2008 and 2012, but no one would confuse me with a supporter of the academic majority. So being a registered Democrat or Republican doesn't tell you all that much. But a 22-0 ratio does seem a little untoward, but the department chair said no problem. In fact, he said in Johnson County, which is where the University of Iowa is, there's a Democratic majority, so the fact that we were 22-0 is. Now, there were 2 oddities about this remark. The first is that even people who were not statisticians could know that the ratio in Johnson County, which is 2-to-1 Democrat to Republican, is not the same as 22-0. Secondly, to the best of everyone's knowledge, the University of Iowa did not recruit its faculty solely from Johnson County, Iowa. And so the partisan breakdown in Johnson County, Iowa was really irrelevant to the approach. Another Americanist, however, this was pointed out by a number of critics, and so a number of Sarah Hanley, who was a women's historian who was also a critic of Moyar, said that this issue was overblown because there simply isn't a downside to having no Republicans in the department at all. It's relatively rare that you get people who are willing to admit this sort of thing. It does suggest a lack of welcoming of dissenting viewpoints on campus. Moyer thought of suing and ultimately chose not to. Iowa was involved in another similar lawsuit at its law school last year, which was settled out of court. The Moyer case was unusually stark and unusually clear-cut, but it did sort of raise questions as to what kinds of things might go on in less transparent episodes. By the way, Iowa in this search wound up hiring a diplomatic historian whose specialty was racism among American troops in the US occupation of the Philippines in the 1890s, and whose courses dealt with race and in the world. Now, in response to this line of critique, those who kind of defend the way things are done on campus raise three objections. The first, which is the silliest, is that students get a traditional version of American history at high school, and so we don't need to worry about what they get we don't need to worry about covering those things at college. This is a line of argument that can't be taken seriously. The argument that what you learn in high school therefore means you don't have to learn about it in college is absurd, and as I'll be talking about in a couple of minutes, this argument ultimately works to the disadvantage of the critics anyway. The second argument is that, well, it's true we don't have a lot of people who do more traditional approaches to the American past, and yeah, it's true we are training future American citizens, but they get it from other courses taught by non-specialists, so we don't really need to worry. This, too, is a kind of peculiar argument. Academic freedom as a principle is based in part on the assumption that our special training means that we can bring our research-based knowledge into the classroom. When you have a program which is being taught by people who have no specialization in what they're talking about, the argument for academic freedom is really much weaker. And the problem with that is illustrated in part by it's taught by non-specialists in UCLA. UCLA is, again, one of these top 10 departments. This is a list of the U.S. history non-broad survey courses that were taught by that was taught at UCLA last spring. And you see a more or less unsurprising mixture, lots of race and gender, not too much in terms of traditional history, a bit on social history. But if you look at those two bottom courses, these are courses that seem relatively mainstream in their approaches. And so it would seem to say, well, UCLA, maybe they don't cover a lot of more traditional approaches to the past, but they do cover some. Now, that first approach, U.S. social movements in the 1960s and 1970s, those of you who are not history majors, think back to your high school history surveys, which you've been just told are so valuable you don't need to learn about it in college. There are lots of interesting social movements that are occurring in the 1960s and 70s, some on the left, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement, but some on the right, the religious right, the anti-abortion movement, the anti-tax movement, which is a very interesting grassroots movement. But in this course, the required readings are the books that I have italicized here on the top left. You won't see much on right-wing social activity in the 60s and 70s. In fact, you won't see anything on it. And again, the course title is U.S. Social Movements, not left-wing U.S. social movements. The sense is that there are no significant social movements to cover. The second, the one diplomatic history course, the summary of the course is down at the bottom, and it reflects this kind of Leffian approach that the only way that you can do something traditional means that you have to celebrate the American past. This view of the historiography, that traditional historiography avoids confronting the ways in which America participated in a broader world shaped by colonial empires, that view went out around 1963, but since the course was taught by a non-specialist, they didn't seem to be aware. The third argument that's raised by people who sort of defend the status quo is the political science argument. And we do have a political science here who teaches many of these topics, and to some extent it's true. There are lots of these themes which are taught by political science. There is this movement within political science called American Political Development, which is a relatively new subfield and which is kind of a hybrid of history and political science. But of course, this doesn't really get at the question. Since political science was around 30 or 40 years ago covering these matters, it doesn't seem to explain why things changed when they did. So the explanations really don't work, I think, very well. Okay. So why does any of this matter? You know, academic subdisciplines change all the time. This may be a slightly extreme change, but why should any of us care? So I wanted to offer three reasons as to why this issue is significant. The first deals with legal and in some instances, ethical obligations of colleges and universities. We live in a period in which the concept of American exceptionalism has become a kind of political cudgel. I mean, Republicans have used it against Obama. It's become this unthinking approach. But there are ways in which the United States, if it's not exceptional, is very unusual. And one is this idea that the public purse has an obligation to promote education, if not for all, at least for a much broader segment of society than had been traditional the case in Europe, even in European democracies. You sort of see this in the quote that I have here from John Adams in 1776. You see it in the last significant act of the Articles of Confederation, the Northwest Ordinance, which explicitly says that the idea of promoting education is a legitimate government function in these new territories. And for our purposes, the key piece of legislation was this Civil War measure called the Morrill Act, sponsored by Justin Morrill, who was a Republican senator from Vermont. Only got through because the Southerners were out of the Congress during the Civil War. They were very much opposed to this. And Morrill's idea was that government resources, in this case land, could be donated to states to create new public universities, sometimes called land-grant universities. Here's a map that lists them all. There were around 70 that were created under the Morrill Act. There are a whole bunch of others that are created in the Reconstruction period, mostly historically black colleges and universities in the South. And then there's a Clinton-era expansion of the act that deals with Native American universities, mostly in the upper Midwest. And the Morrill Act basically said that for these universities, you're making a bargain. You're getting public money. If it weren't for public money, you wouldn't exist. But in exchange, you will provide a broad education. You will train future citizens. And it's not just the land-grant universities. If you take a look at the mission statements, which admittedly very few people wind up ever doing, at lots of colleges and universities, you'll see things like promoting citizenship as a mission, as a basic mission of lots of schools. These are clips from Michigan, from Illinois, from Santa Clara, from James Madison. And it's kind of hard to imagine how you can train future citizens of the United States if you're not even giving them an opportunity to study wide aspects of the history of the entity from which they came. A second reason why this issue is of significance is public education. Remember, I mentioned before that one of the arguments that's often raised is, well, we don't need to cover these issues in college because you all got it in high school and it was so wonderfully taught in high school that you don't need to learn about it ever again. If the principle of academic freedom in the US means anything, it means that for the most part, the government should not be telling professors, colleges, academic departments what they should teach in the classroom. It's essentially what it means. However, there's one really big exception to that, and that's public teachers. Many universities, including the university at which I now teach, Brooklyn College, stay afloat in part because they're subsidized by tuition dollars that come from students who are getting master's degrees. And while it would be nice to believe that students get master's degrees because they just have this extraordinary desire to engage in lifelong learning, for the most part, they're doing it because they either have to do it. In New York, any social studies teacher has to get a master's degree in history, or because they get a higher salary as a public school teacher if they have a master's degree. But there's a trade-off here. The assumption here is that state governments are either ordering or encouraging teachers to get master's degrees, not out of the goodness of their heart, but because they will get something out of that they can then bring to their students in their own classrooms. So this is one area in which legislators actually do have a legitimate reason to inquire what is being taught. Every state in the United States has some kind of state board of education. Some of these boards are elected, some of them are appointed by governors, but in any case, they involve the political classes. They bring students together, they bring teachers together, some cases academics, in some cases politicians. These are the requirements from New York. New York is not a conservative state. There are some states, Texas, Kansas, where the requirements are openly conservative. The Texas history standards were changed last year to require all public school students to learn about Newt Gingrich. New York is it's down the middle. But if you look at these standards, especially the first and the fifth, what you see is an expectation on the part of the state of New York that public school students will learn a lot about what is generally considered to be traditional US history. And these are some of the requirements. They're called the regions in New York that make clear that students, for instance, are supposed to know about the Supreme Court, they're supposed to know about wars, they're supposed to know about significant state papers, they're supposed to know about critical activities in international affairs. Now, students in general who are getting master's degrees around the country, it's not clear how they're learning any of this information if they don't have an opportunity to learn from people who are actually specialists in it. It's not clear why they're benefiting at all really from master's degrees. At some point, state legislatures are going to start asking this question. It's not an unreasonable question. And that ties into the third reason why this issue should be of significance even for people who have no concern of history. And that is that it's a symbol of a kind of broader intolerance on campus, which I think was best approached in this 2004 piece. I don't quite like the liberal groupthink title, but this by a historian, an English professor from Emory called Mark Bauerlein. And Bauerlein's argument is that college campuses, because there aren't a whole lot of dissenting thoughts, especially within the faculty, tend towards what he terms this law of group polarization, that more extreme ideas tend to become accepted wisdom if everyone more or less agrees the same thing. And it's based off legal research that looks at juries in product liability cases where you have a 12-person jury where all 12 are convinced that the business was, acted inappropriately, but there are 3 that are really committed, and jury awards tend to veer towards the extreme end rather than the moderate end. And there are a couple of examples in recent times where we've seen this kind of groupthink in action, where campus attitudes have filtered into the broader public consciousness in a way that rarely occurs. The first was in 2006 at Duke, a case I wrote about a lot. I co-wrote a book on it. When 3 lacrosse players were accused of rape, it turns out falsely, by an African-American stripper who had come to perform for them at a spring break party. Before they were arrested, 88 faculty members, many of whom were from the history department, published this ad in the campus newspaper in which they definitively said something happened to the woman and in which they promised that they would continue to speak up regardless of what the court said. This would be called a rush to judgment. History professors were very much behind this approach. William Chafe, who historian of race and of gender at Duke, published an op-ed in which he suggested that the spirit of Emmett Till was lurking in the lacrosse player's house. This, by the way, was on the basis of 6 days worth of information at the time, showing his intellectual seriousness. He got the year in which Till was lynched wrong in the op-ed. And a historian of Native American history named Peter Wood did an interview in which he suggested that lacrosse players in his class were surly and poorly behaved. Wood ultimately retracted this statement after receiving a letter from attorneys of the lacrosse players. The lacrosse case didn't look particularly good for Duke, and what made it look so troubling was this sense that there didn't seem to be any reasonable voices on the Duke campus, and that led to a lot of questions being asked by alumni. A second and more recent episode is the recent action by a group called the American Studies Association. Again, you see this, the pattern here is a pattern of a very wide disparity between campus attitudes and public attitudes, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but especially at public universities, I think it's really troubling. This is a Gallup poll looking at sympathy towards Israel. Israel is quite popular in the United States, especially popular among Republicans, but nonetheless popular overall. This past December, the American Studies Association announced that their executive committee unanimously passed, and their membership passed by a 2-to-1 margin, a resolution calling for a boycott of all Israeli universities. They said they would not boycott Israeli academics, but Israeli academics who came to an American academic conference funded by their university, which of course all of them do, would be subject for the boycott. So effectively, this was a boycott of academics. This was done very confidently by the association. They expected an outpouring of public support. They got an outpouring. It was not public support that they got. Almost 200 college and university presidents, including the president of Williams, denounced the American Studies Association. These are people who have to deal with the public and raise money from the public. Only 6 departments have actually withdrawn from the American Studies Association. So the backlash among the faculty is much less. This is a statement from the Middlebury College president, which was really the strongest of the presidential criticisms of the ASA. There's been criticism in the press by politicians of both parties. And this is problematic in part because the American Studies Association hasn't been able to come up with a credible explanation why they did what they did. The president of the association was interviewed by the New York Times. He was asked why he started with Israel when you have lots of countries that seem to have human rights abuses. His answer was, in a classic line, one has to start somewhere. This didn't quite explain why Israel and not China, Russia, Zimbabwe, but one could guess why Israel was selected. And there have been calls in state legislatures, including in the New York State Legislature, to defund colleges that continue to affiliate with the ASA, which is problematic in some other ways. So what we have is this odd situation in which the ideological midpoint of the faculty, especially humanities and social sciences faculty, is really quite far away from the ideological midpoint of the public as a whole. So what can be done about it? Well, there are a couple of issues that I think are problematic. From a pragmatic angle alone, it would seem to me that colleges and universities might want to address the issue. In the last few weeks, there have been 2 very interesting articles. One was published in the Post, one published in the Times. I've excerpted them here. Looking at how American politics has changed and changed dramatically at the state level in the last decade, and especially since 2010. Republicans, particularly Democrats, have begun to catch up, funded a lot of these obscure state legislative elections, and what we've gotten are these one-party states that have become very aggressive, either Republican or Democratic states as a result, in a way that's quite unlike anything that we've seen in recent American political history. Now, if I were a Republican state legislator in South Dakota, say, responsive to a very conservative constituency and eager to distinguish myself among my colleagues, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that attacking a group like the American Studies Association, or the campus equivalent of the Group of 88, is a political winner. And in this kind of new unstable atmosphere, it seems to me that colleges and universities may want to pay a little more attention to state legislators than they have in the past. There is this kind of baseline assumption, I think, at a lot of colleges, that academic freedom means that, first of all, that professors should never be criticized from the outside. And secondly, among public universities, that taxpayer dollars should continue to flow to these universities without the legislators asking any questions. It's my experience that legislatures very rarely give money without asking any questions, and Republican state legislatures in particular have proven quite reluctant to do so. So how can the issue be resolved? Well, there are two solutions that I don't think are at all likely. One is that the solution will occur from within, that these departments that have redefined themselves in the last 20 or 30 years will suddenly decide, well, gee, it really would be nice if we did more traditional topics, or we're going to hire lots of new people, or offer new courses, or give scholarships. That's not going to happen. What also I think is not going to happen is kind of a blow-up change from without. There is this one tantalizing example for critics of the academic status quo, and that is the George Mason Law School. Around 20 years ago, the leadership of George Mason looked at their standing in the U.S. News and World Report law school ratings. They saw that they weren't very high, but they saw that there was a potential market value for talented, conservative, or right of center, or libertarian students who were not being well served by traditional law school faculty, which tended to lean very much to the left. And so they started hiring right of center and especially libertarian faculty members. And the model more or less worked. The quality of the student body at George Mason rose. The tantalizing U.S. News and World Report ranking rose as well. And some have argued that, look, well, colleges and universities could do this, that, kind of mid-level liberal arts college could reorient its curriculum and, attract talented students in that way. That, however, is very difficult to achieve. The way that tenure works in the academy makes radical change difficult, if not impossible, to accomplish. So I don't think we'll be seeing a George Mason approach anytime soon. So what might we see? Well, the first is greater activism from trustees. One of the criticisms that's often made, or fallback defenses, is that faculty are in charge of colleges, and faculty should make decisions, not outsiders. And there's a lot of, I think, merit to that approach, that outsiders really are not all that competent to make decisions about colleges. But there are lots of other people who are responsible for decisions at colleges. And the most important of these people are trustees, especially at public colleges and universities, because trustees are, after all, representatives of the public, but at private colleges as well. Trustees have to sign off on financial decisions. They generally have to sign off, although generally they'll do it just with a check mark on personnel matters. There's no particular reason why trustees cannot be more active in at least asking questions about why there is not a more intellectually robust environment on campus. And there have been some boards of trustees, the CUNY board over the last decade is a good example of this. The Colorado Board of Regents from around 2002 to 2008 was another example. We've done this sort of thing, and there's this organization called the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, which has promoted this idea that trustees should be playing a more active role to push back against one-sided faculty approaches, because faculty are not doing their jobs. The second group that can and should be more active, because they too have a more appropriate role, are alumni. Lots of alumni ultimately donate to their institutions. Many of you will be donating to this institution 15 or 20 years down the road. But one of the striking things about lots of these alumni donations is they're frequently open-ended. I had a wonderful experience at Princeton or Bryn Mawr or the University of Michigan, so I'm going to fork over $10,000 or $15,000. The question is why alumni are not more aggressive in overseeing the money that they're donating. There have been some really interesting legal cases, including one at Princeton, where money was given and then not used for the purpose that the donation was offered, and another quite interesting case at Yale. But one possibility is alumni donations as a way essentially of working around the faculty mindset. Because remember where I started, however ideological typical universities and colleges are, they like money more than anything else, and they very rarely will turn down money, especially when it's framed in a more egalitarian and more citizen-minded approach. Now, there are always problems with these alumni approaches. These are two significant programs, one of which is wholly or almost wholly alumni funded, the Princeton program, the other which is more mixed. The LBJ School, which is down at Texas, is one of the best institutions of public policy in the country. It's just extraordinary faculty, some coming from alumni donations, some coming from the state. It's very rigorous, very academic in its approach. The Princeton program had a really good reputation until around 4 or 5 years ago. Its director is a man named Robert George. Those of you who follow referenda politics, George has become very active in these anti-gay marriage referenda. And the politics has increasingly predominated in the Madison program in the last few years, which is, of course, the danger with these alumni-funded programs. But as a whole, I think the alumni programs have done a lot more good than they have done harm, and alumni can do much more to broaden the discourse on campus. And there is one final group that can and should do more. That's parents, and that's you. There are relatively few purchases that people fork over substantial amounts of money without looking what they're getting. 4 years at an elite college or university costs $200,000. If you're on financial aid, it might be $25,000 or $40,000 or $50,000. If you're in the middle class, that's still an awful lot of money. And yet parents in particular tend not to look at exactly what it is that they're getting for that money. When I did the book on the Duke case, I did a lot of book talk. You do a book talk to promote the book. And I did a lot of these talks to groups of suburban parents in New York City. And to a person, they were stunned by what I was saying, in part because I might have gotten this response 8 or 10 times. But they were saying, well, it crossed their mind to look at department websites to see what is being taught at the colleges that they are sending their sons or daughters to. There is no other purchase in our current economy that it's even conceivable that someone would spend $200,000 on without even looking what they were getting. And for students, there is this interesting sort of political philosophy approach done by one of these George Mason law professors as a blogger at this libertarian blog called the Volokh Conspiracy. The guy's name is Ilya Sumnin. And Sumnin has offered this idea of defensive federalism, of voting with your feet. That if you're an opponent of gay marriage, you can move to Mississippi. If you like lots of spending on public education, you can move to Mississippi. You can move to Massachusetts. You can leave Mississippi. And the result is that you get people you sort of can move to an environment with which they are more comfortable. Colleges and universities want talented students. And if they started losing even a small number of talented students to more congenial approaches, and while I've painted a broad brush here in some of my talks, there are differences between departments. For instance, Yale's department really is, I think, a very, very good history department. If you're interested in English, they're really good English departments. If that student movement started to occur, there would be a market incentive for colleges and universities to respond. These are all slow and long processes that are likely to occur, but since there isn't a quick fix, and since the problem doesn't seem to be getting much better, these are at least possible solutions. So that's all that I have. Hopefully you all have a few questions.
On that last note, do you think that there's potential inevitability then that we see a future landscape of higher education where schools really they all have very distinct ideological bents, and there's more of a market for going to applying and matriculating to a school that matches your own personal preferences?
if this occurs, it would be less than ideal. There are explicitly conservative institutions in the current academic landscape. Hillsdale College in Michigan, Brigham Young University in Utah. I'm going to go really extreme, Bob Jones in South Carolina. But Hillsdale and BYU are considered to be reputable academic institutions. And yet, no one would consider Hillsdale or BYU to be an elite academic institution. And the reason that they're not is that they really don't open themselves up to ideas on the left. They don't open themselves to sort of liberal pedagogies. And since they started exclusively from the right, they sort of are left with this kind of rump approach. Whereas I think it's at a place like Williams, where you have a lot of people who were been here for a long, long time. You don't have this. There may be an imbalance, but there's not an imbalance like BYU or Hillsdale. Now the question is, if you project ahead 20 years, will we see more institutions like BYU and Hillsdale on the right, and more institutions like, say, Oberlin or Wesleyan on the left? And I suspect the answer to that question is yes, in part for the point that I was raising earlier about state legislatures. I would simply be stunned if in the next 5 to 10 years we don't see some red state legislatures really start to crack down on the general approach of colleges in their state. And I think it would be a terrible thing, but it seems virtually inevitable to me that there was this recent instance at Kansas. Those of you who follow gun politics may know of it. I was a professor at the University of Kansas after the shooting in Washington, D.C., who issued this, it was an awful and very tasteless tweet. He said, the next time people get shot, I hope it's the NRA kids that get killed. And he was trying to say that the NRA people would be more sympathetic to gun control if it affected their family, but that isn't really what he said. Now the reaction to that was for the Speaker of the Kansas State House to call the Kansas Board of Regents and to tell the chairman of the board that, oh, by the way, you get money from the state, and if you don't take care of this professor, we may take action. And Kansas suspended the professor for a semester with pay, but nonetheless, again, for a tweet that was wholly outside of his classroom activities. And the state just instituted a new social media policy in which they said that any professor in the state of Kansas at a public university can be fired for a tweet or any public remark that runs contrary to the best interests of public universities in Kansas. What is the best interest of the public universities in Kansas? Whatever the president of the relevant public university says. So this kind of activism, we've already seen a little bit. I suspect we'll see more. I don't think it will be a good thing, but I do think it's likely to occur. And when it does occur, as in this Kansas case, there's an element, I think, it's a bit rich for the faculty who have been wholly indifferent to how their actions have been portrayed to the public for the last 15 or 20 years, to suddenly say, oh, we should have a welcoming environment from the public. This goes two ways, and if you're going to engage the public, you have to do so. You can't simply say, we know best, we don't want public involvement. So the short answer to your question is yes, I think we will see more, and I think it will be a bad thing.
Yes. So isn't the decision between, the more traditional, the traditional route of, academic history and the new, more liberal, route that you've kind of explained. So the choice between them, isn't that, inherently a ideological one? And so you mentioned that this traditional system is necessary to kind of achieve these mission statements of creating good citizens, but wouldn't the response to that be, well, that's why we need these new liberal professors in order to create a better citizens? And isn't that an ideological question?
Two elements here. The short answer to your question is you need both. And a department, this is why the Hillsdale model, for instance, is a bad model. A department that consisted of 10, let's say, US history professors, all 10 of whom were historians of conservatism, would be the flip side of all of these issues. So the concern here is not, go back to what I was saying earlier, the default approach to good history is to expand knowledge, not to contract. So the idea that you would want a department that had no historians of race, no historians of gender would be just as objectionable to a department that had 20 historians of race or 20 historians of gender. You sort of need both approach. With the issue, the specific issue of citizenship, that I think is in part an ideological question. But it's an ideological question in which I suspect there is a relatively broad consensus. For instance, if you were to poll the 435 members of the House who don't agree on a whole lot, and ask them, do you believe that future citizens should have a firm understanding of the Constitution, the political philosophy behind the Constitution? I suspect that 430 would say yes. So yes, you can say there's an ideological dispute, but the ideological dispute is very different within the academy and without. One final point. I am hesitant to use words either liberal or ideological to describe some of these approaches. For instance, I mentioned my advisor, Kerry Erie, is very prestigious diplomatic historian. Erie ideologically is a pacifist. His scholarship has heavy emphasis on cultural connections as well as political and economic connections. If you read his work or looked at his rhetoric, you would classify him likely as a liberal. But within this framework that I've been outlining here, he would be classified essentially as something of a traditionalist, although there are elements that he's able to reach the line. So I think one of the things that when we talk about issues on campus, phrases like liberal and conservative can have very different meanings than the commonly understood phrase of the term. I had an amusing episode several years ago. I was interviewed by a reporter, and again, politically I'm a Democrat and I'm reasonably liberal on most issues. My parents were both public school teachers, and the reporter knew the kinds of positions I had taken on campus matters. And the reporter asked me, she's from the New York Times, she said, well, I had heard you were very conservative. Weren't your parents wealthy residents of the North Shore of Massachusetts? She heard this from people on campus who didn't like me. I said, well, no. And she kept asking the question. She couldn't process how someone who could be liberal politically could question some of these campus attitudes. Eventually, she did accept the fact that my parents were not wealthy dilettantes on the North Shore, but I don't think I ever quite convinced her that I wasn't actually a conservative.
Actually, I have a more practical question. If you had a promising student at Brooklyn where you teach, and they were very interested in political history, diplomatic history, American foreign relations, and they said, I really don't know whether I should go get a PhD in history or political science, what sort of advice would you give them?
Oh, I always tell them to go to political science. It's depressing because I'm there is a graduate center at CUNY that gives PhDs, and so I like working with good PhD students as much as the next person. But one of the things I think that all faculty have an obligation when they're dealing with students who want to enter the academic profession is that we have to be honest. First of all, your chances of getting a good job are not great to begin with. But in the kinds of areas in which I deal, it's hard to imagine that someone who did sort of traditional political or diplomatic history would have a good chance of getting a job. That's a problem in and of itself, because essentially you have this sort of chicken and egg approach where good students who want to do this kind of work are encouraged out of history for the very practical reason that they can't get a job. And if they can't get a job, you you can't in good conscience tell them to spend 5 or 6 years of their lives slaving away on a dissertation that ultimately won't get them anything. So yeah, I've given that advice several times, and generally the students I've given the advice to have accepted it, but it's, from a practical angle, it's really the only advice that you can give in the current climate. I'd like to get to the point where I don't have to give that advice anymore.
You mentioned in your talk a lot about how forces for promoting intellectual diversity could be trustees, alumni, and then you said students and parents. You talked a lot about parents, but for the students that are already at these institutions, kind of where can they go in terms of, does that start with the dialogue with just the professors, or how do you see that playing out?
Well, there are lots of things that can be done. I mean, I'm really quite impressed with what the group of students has put together through here. To some extent, just bringing people in, getting new ideas in approach. Students can have an impact, even in some instances, on curriculum. When I was here, so I was here from '95 to '99. The college had hired a historian of Hispanic studies. And the reason that they had done it was some Hispanic students occupied the college president's office, and the president didn't like the bad publicity, so they decided, well, we're going to bring in this person if this is what we have the choice. Institutions don't like bad publicity. Elite institutions that rely on talented students particularly don't like bad publicity. And so there are lots of sort of media-oriented activities that students can undertake to embarrass institutions. Not, of course, that I would ever recommend students do such a thing, that can at least bring attention to needed issues. The last thing is that there is an element of walking with your feet. It's my sense, certainly based on my time here, was that this was an institution whose leadership, and I sense that it remains that way, although I don't have any firsthand knowledge, that actually is sensitive to student concerns. I mean, one of the big differences for me between teaching at Brooklyn and teaching at Williams is that I like to think I do a good job teaching at Brooklyn, but there isn't a culture at the university where the expectation is that every professor needs to be a great teacher and needs to sort of work with students. There is, I think, an expectation of that sort of thing here. I'm not sure that it's always realized, but that kind of culture can be used by students as a way essentially of shaming an institution to live up to the values that it holds. So I do think that there are avenues, op-eds, this sort of thing. I mean, we had an instance several years ago at Brooklyn where and Brooklyn, again, it's a commuter school. The students are not there a whole lot. But one group of students took over the student newspaper. At Brooklyn, the editorial boards at the newspapers are elected. And you get elected by actually showing up for the election because no one wants to do the job. But they were very sharp students, and they were sharply critical of the provost, and they were able to essentially derail the curricular reform as on their own. Administrators don't expect students to be involved in these sorts of things, and so when students are involved, it actually gets noticed, even if it's a relatively small group of students who are.
I've got a lot of things that are going through my head, but I'm just going to touch on a couple of them. And I'm an alumnus. I graduated in '83. I've been involved significantly as an alum, class agent, union organizer, class president, and so forth. And I don't want to say I'm pessimistic. I like to consider myself, an eternal optimist. But in the last 5 years, I've butted my head up against the college on various things and tried to go about it politely and sensitively and so forth. And some of the options or possible remedies that were touched on. For example, I think the fact that the trustees is such a secretive process. I think you're suggesting to the gentleman over there about students getting involved. Yes, and that does work on occasion, but at a place like Williams, the course load is so overwhelming. If the issue is right, it'll happen. But for example, and you may be aware of this, I think it was 5 years ago, there was a professor here who was a total fraud. And he may be finishing his jail term now. But I tried to get some answers on that, and the students actually, when he was summarily fired after pleading in the middle of the semester guilty to all of these fraud charges, just a raft of comments came out from the students on the student WSO and so forth about what a terrible student he was. And so it kind of went back and forth. Well, if he was this bad, why did... And he couldn't have been that bad because the students had complained before, but the students were saying, well, you know, we didn't want to necessarily challenge him. Some students, or one at least, said he was an easy A, and those sorts of things. But, you know, as an alum trying to get answers to that, I think something else that might play into trying to get fundamental and rudimentary change is the fierce competition. There's talk about how amongst elite colleges it's like a marketplace.
Right.
You know, who has the best student center, who has this. So to admit any wrongdoing, I'll just close by saying what I had hoped might happen there, what I was hoping in terms of leadership, was that the college, and I wrote about this, I put an op-ed into the paper and so forth, that a leader, because this man had also defrauded Yale. I mean, it's quite a story if you ever look into it. He was Professor Bernard Moore. Was that you admit your mistakes. I'm not a Christie fan, and I'm not saying he's innocent, but what he did was what you have to do as part of leadership, and I think colleges are even less inclined to do that. Williams, for example, in Yale could have said, well, we really got taken in this process, and we're embarrassed as hell, but if we got taken, who else is getting taken? And it's incumbent upon us to call, for example, an analysis of all the visiting professor hires, the processes, sorry. But that doesn't happen. It's like, and I felt like, hey, you know, don't talk about this, you know. And they had a way to do that because he sued for Cobra coverage for 4 or 5 months so they could say, oh, we're being sued. But anyway, I've gone on enough here, but I'm just not, and I had 2 classmates, by the way, I'll just mention, who were trustees for 5 years, and I basically felt that it was, and I knew both of them when I was here, which was a rarity even with a class of 500, and it really wasn't helpful because they were so tight-lipped.
Well, I do think that there is a culture among trustees not to be as active as they really should be. There's nothing in what I've said that should suggest these ideas of reform are easy. They're not. And your point about colleges being unwilling to admit mistakes is extremely well taken. It is very rare that you get colleges and universities who are willing to do this. In the lacrosse case, for instance, the college never investigated why the university never investigated why it handled the case the way it did. So that I think that one of the things you have to be realistic on is what you'll get and what you won't get. What you won't get is a college president saying, we're wrong, you're right. Thank you very much for showing us the right way. But to avoid bad publicity, you sometimes can get things that are helpful, but there are obvious limitations. And it is true that students here I have a heavy workload, but I gave the example that I had from the students that I had at Brooklyn. The students I have there take 6 courses a semester and sometimes work, and yet these students were able to function. I mean, you don't need a lot of students, but you do need a kind of committed core as a way of doing it. You can't do it on your own.
Just thank Professor Leichter.
Thank you very much for coming.